Right, so this is my weekly update of what's been happening. 12th week of lockdown, although it's lockdown-ish. I have noticed from looking before that I do tend to drag things out. I'll try and speak quicker, but I have to anyway because there's a lot more things happening in the last week. So there's a lot to get through. If you want links, you'll be able to see them off the presentations, which Simon will have, and the YouTube will go up quickly. But if you really want something quickly, do email me on that, because I can't every week do a update on the RDRF website. Okay, so just to start off with, I don't spend time doing what's happening overseas because we've got enough to get on with, but it is worth looking at this quick video of a cycling traffic jam on Place de la Bastille in Paris. And here's Rue de Rivoli yesterday morning, rush hour, cyclist rush hour. That's inspiring. Okay, so let's start off with some of the numbers. Mark Treasure said this looked like a noisy distribution. It's the official DFT distribution as specified by the Minister, Grant Shapps, and it is uppy and downy. The spikes are all on those shaded bits, which are the weekends. Initially you think, oh wow, 300%, but when you look at it a bit more carefully and you think about how it starts from 16th of March, and we tend to get an increase in the on season of about 20–30%, and it's been particularly warm, we're looking at more like about 100% or doubling. That's in the UK, but that's since pre-lockdown. And as I say, it would have gone up a certain amount anyway. So a bit more on the stats. As I say, my estimate is probably doubling in the week and more at weekends since before lockdown, a bit less if you look at it year on year. Sport England have done a study, but they say the proportion of people cycling. Okay, well, proportion of people cycling is different from making a cycle journey every day, but it's still, again, you can talk about it roughly doubling. Leicester did a year-on-year count and came up with 45%. Medway's down at only 27%. On the cycleways in Enfield, numbers are up about 80%. There's also this survey from Transport Focus. That's kind of interesting because it's looked at each week, and it's gone from about 6% of transport mode used in the last 7 days to 9%. Again, maybe can't say much about that, but it's worthwhile looking at. My view is we're talking about 50 to 100%. We really need to cement that. We really need to cement it and increase it, in my view. Walking's more difficult to look at, as usual. We don't really know. Now, I think this is actually quite big news. I don't know if you saw Country File this last Sunday. If not, catch it on iPlayer. It was about cycling as a form of transport in the rural areas. We often forget the rural areas, but they're important. And this was, I think, a very good piece with Roger Geffen from Cycling UK and others. It was almost pretty perfect, talked about the problems of high-speed motor vehicle use in the countryside, but it was pretty non-patronizing. Don't forget, this isn't in the usual transport practitioners, campaigners bubble. This is seen by 5 to 8 million people. So very important bit of good news there. Okay, so we've had the notification of the allocations nationally on this link. This is the £200 million in England outside of London. that I talked about last week, 25 million in London, plus the 55 million already given for active travel, plus the 25 million for the vouchers. Here are allocations in the regions in 2 phases and in the combined authority. I haven't done the single boroughs and local authorities. It is, I have to say, a theme of this week is it's sometimes a bit complicated, whether you're talking about bids, about work that's already started, about money that had been allocated already, about a first phase or a second phase. And it's also a bit more complicated when you talk about London. So that will become apparent. There is sometimes a bit of confusion. Okay, and this is one of the things that comes from a local campaigner. I won't mention who she is or the council, but I just want to read through this. And she says, just got an update on the council's plan and it's really bad. It's vague, it's not public, it's not now. They misunderstood the brief and the funding, and I'm so tired of asking for the same thing. Disgustingly, whenever you say something, it's shot down with, we've made the decision to focus on the care sector, as if these measures have nothing to do with an emergency, as if it has nothing to do with preventing a second wave. We don't know what they will submit tomorrow. They haven't yet. Guessing it will be quick wins. It's so stupid. Councillors didn't see the plan until today either. That was written on the 4th. It's finally come out on the council website today. And so, you know, we're going through it and seeing how good it is. On a preliminary, I would have said it wasn't brilliant, but anyway. What campaigners also have to do, here's another letter from someone saying, hey council, when are you going to publish details of what you've been allocated for? And someone else saying, we aren't asking for things others aren't doing elsewhere. Please show us your submission to the Department of Transport and save us giving an FOI. It's this kind of persistent campaigning you have to do. Here's this, on a slightly different note, Adam Tranter tweeted about this. He's the commissioner in Coventry. And sorry, just got to turn off my alarm clock, waking me up for this session. Adam Tranter said he's getting lots of people saying, oh, well, you know, in the city centres, we've got to have the passing trade by cars, you know, and he said he issued a call here saying, where's the evidence about how good it is to have people walking and cycling for retail? And a lot of people answered with reference to the TfL and other research. So campaigning can be good, it can be fruitful, you have to keep on at it. Okay, some updates on what's been happening in the UK outside London. Devon County Council has been doing filters for a 4-kilometre quiet route in Exeter. Also work in these towns in Devon. Casper Hughes has been tweeting various things, an interview with a very interesting medic who was out on her bike using the filtered route. Surrey County Council submitted bid for the first tranche. Medway submitted a bid with no local low traffic neighbourhoods. Edinburgh, we've been worried about. The councillor there said, well, I checked it out myself, and there's some wands and cycle lanes have been put in. The bad news, Portsmouth are not putting in a cycle lane because lots of people are going by car and they don't want to hold up the cars or something. Similarly in Plymouth, they've bid for £250,000 for a pop-up lane on a more or less traffic-free route. Worcestershire County Council, you'll see that one councillor, a councillor Amos, has been holding up everything, saying that the instructions in the 23rd of May guidance sent out by the Department for Transport, the big announcement from Grant Shapps on national television, says it doesn't apply to us. Leicester have published a new street design guide here and are starting work on a pop-up mini Holland at Brownstone Gate. Oxfordshire have been given £600,000 over 8 weeks, then another 2.3 million. I don't know the quality of this stuff. You'll have to get the local people to go through it and present their assessments. One thing I noticed was, don't forget, there have been clear instructions to have curb segregated cycle lanes, and they're saying install dashed markings to inform of cycle lanes, including symbols and signs. What is that? Looks suspiciously like advisory cycle lanes. Right. Birmingham City Council. Now, I don't know where this money is from exactly, because it doesn't appear to be in that first set of allocations I referred to. But here's something from Councillor Zafar saying, been allocated £1 million from first tranche with match funding. That's interesting. 1.6 million, 14 schemes outlined in our submission to government for delivery over the coming weeks. They include pop-up cycle lanes. This is interesting, a park and pedal program to provide park and cycle options, and branded places for people, LTN launch. So it's all there. Now, Trafford, you will have heard about this. So this here, this bit with the cones is in Trafford. This bit on the same road, also in Greater Manchester, doesn't have any cones because it's under Manchester City Council. It's one of the other councils that comes under Greater Manchester. And they don't seem to have got the memo, or rather the instructions about temporary measures needed now. And there was a correspondence on Twitter from the councillor involved saying, oh, we really want to do permanent stuff, which she seemed to be using as an excuse for not doing temporary stuff. And I looked at the correspondence, and I have drafted letters for councillors in my time. I've read numerous letters from councillors in my time, and I really couldn't get it. She just seemed to be saying no. It didn't make sense. She was just avoiding the issue. Again, it's one person, Sir Richard Leese, leader of Manchester City Council, seems to be getting in the way of measures. Now, I thought I'd then bring up a thread from Chris Boardman, and he's saying lots of people are pushing for details on our emergency travel measures, which are going to be released this week. But I want you to know these things. It's not my job to dictate what happens. I don't have control of the roads, and nor should I. That burden rests with the people you've elected to make those decisions. Now, he's saying what his role is. He's describing what the situation is, and that's all very good and right. But it could be preparing us for the fact that we're not going to get what the mayor has actually been saying should come through, because he and Chris Boardman don't really have that amount of control. But, you know, maybe this might change if, in terms of the warnings about the Department for Transport or others taking control over recalcitrant authorities. We shall see. Here's some messaging. I just want to say a few things about messaging. That's the Department for Transport's instructions. Now, Northamptonshire Police. Here's a graphic from the evil road safety lobby, industry rather, I should say. This week is National Bike Week. As the roads get busier, we would like to remind cyclists to stay alert and take extra care, which is presumably more care than the normal care you take. And after National Bike Week, you can go back to taking normal care. Anyway, what was really interesting for me is they put that tweet up and there was an instant pile-on. And, you know, this cheers me. It does cheer me that on social media, when people get things wrong, a lot of people will pile on very politely, firmly saying, come on, guys. So I wrote a response saying, Hi, Northants Police. We had a training day in September 2018, Road Danger Reduction Forum, for training police officers with West Midlands Police, the very excellent West Midlands Police Road Harm Prevention Group, and Northants Police didn't turn up. And I'm just saying, we hope you'll carry out close passing policing, otherwise there is extra justification for the kind of comments you've just received. Contrast that within London, Andy Cox, who's second in command of the Met's Road and Transport, Road Traffic Police Command, whatever it's called. He has been very positive throughout, and he says, we'd like to receive feedback. Loads of people sent in feedback. He's taking it seriously. He's tweeting about it, and I don't think he's perfect, but nobody is. He's very good, and the Met have the biggest traffic police force in all of Europe, albeit at much lower strength than it was before 2010 and before the late 90s. So you can have positive approaches from police officers. Do look at the Twitter feed of Superintendent Cox, and if you're in London, say thank you. It's important to say thank you to the positive things. Okay, Glasgow, that's from last week. I don't know if this went through in the June the 4th meeting. Nothing seems to be happening in Bristol. West Sussex County Council seem to be doing some stuff. So those are ones to look at. And we're through to London. Okay, so this is a tweet from the cycling instructors branch of the IWGB. They are offering to do cycle training. They ran a webinar, which Brian was on. So some cycle training is happening in London, one-to-one, that can be done. Ways of supporting cycling other than the infrastructure, very important. There's still an elephant in the room about Silvertown Tunnel. Okay, let's say a bit more about London. Centre for London did a poll. 2/3 people support wider footways and cycle lanes. Over half people support them being permanent. A third of people will say they will cycle more after lockdown, but a third say they will drive more after lockdown. And here's a map of what could happen with regard to increased car parking. The darker boroughs are ones with more people with no car, but someone with a license. So these could fill up with people buying cars or getting cars and parking them and causing extra parking stress, plus more congestion. Here's some links from TfL. They're talking about what they're doing on the cycling network. I've been up and down the temporary cycle lane now, and Park Lane's got some interesting features, raised crossings onto floating bus stops, but it does have some shared use, which I think is a bit manky, and I'm not quite sure how it ends up at the northern end. Balham High Road, couple of cycleways, another 30 kilometers of permanent cycle lanes. Well, yeah, don't forget there were 11,000 kilometers of road in London. Initial 1,000 extra cycle parking spaces, yeah, good, but we've already got about 300,000 people making cycle journeys every day. So, we're going to need a lot more. And they're also talking about changing streets, the footway extensions. I want to say something about the footway extensions. This is, note the blue, specially branded barriers put up by TfL on TfL roads. This is Edgware Road, Main, A5, North-South Road in London. Now, when I put this up, a couple of people said, oh, I thought we were supposed to be getting rid of pedestrian guard railing because they've got these extra rail bits above the barriers. So, I'm kind of wondering, what do people think about them? How do pedestrians react? Because it seems to work in some places, but in other places, they're not coming off the permanent footway because of curbing. There's a pull-in at the junctions. Are they working? For me, on Edgware Road, when I'm cycling, I have to take the lane because I can't filter on the left. I wonder how that's working out for people. And that was a point raised by Jeremy Vine, doing very nice video on Oxford Street. And he was saying, what is this? Is it extra pavement or a new cycle lane? Now, everybody looking at this on this Zoom session will know it's a footway extension, but it doesn't seem to be signed well. And in his video, you've got a woman cycling down it. It can be a bit confusing, could be done better. It's something to keep an eye on. We maybe need a little session on how to do footway extensions properly. Okay, there are the London allocations so far. First round from 2 pots, the next round is the end of this week. There are 2 different kinds of funding, one apparently through TfL, one direct from DFT. It's a bit complicated, mixed up with some people who've already made allocations, and also some people have got programs which need to go to council later this week. So it's a kind of confusing situation. But let's have a closer look at boroughs in London. That's Merton's program. It seems to need to go to a council meeting later on June the 15th, but it's got these 10 local low traffic neighborhoods. Now it's a bit complicated as well because sometimes there is low traffic neighborhood for investigation. Well, what does this mean exactly? I don't know. Newham and Hounslow are doing bits of what I call direct support for cycling. Try Before You Bike scheme in Newham, that's good. And Hounslow's doing some one-to-one adult cycle training. Let's look at Southwark. Now, here's some comments made on what Southwark has said, or rather Southwark's bid. This comes from longtime campaigner Rafe Smith. And he says, much of this is a rehash of older schemes due for delivery in 2019. Now, the guidance has said it can be existing schemes which were due to happen, and that's okay, but he's saying, you know, this should have happened last year. Too little, too late to comply with space reallocation duty, which it is, for a borough with some of the highest public transport use in the UK. Worryingly, no mention of a phase 2 in the officer report, let alone a deadline. In normal times, we'd welcome this package, but we have a pandemic as well as climate emergency. There's a lack of analysis, which is very concerning, leading to a lack of whole route measures for busiest shopping streets and inadequate 1.5 meter cycle lanes. And here the campaign group, Southwark Cyclists, have said exactly the kind of 2 sentences which campaigners will have said throughout our lives. The first sentence, we're very pleased with this initial announcement and these changes are a welcome first step. And then you say, however, we are concerned that Southwark is moving slower than some other London boroughs. That kind of thing. I've said that sort of thing so many times. Okay, Tower Hamlets, program's now moving into the construction phase for the Bethnal Green area. I think it's a low traffic neighborhood. Brent's program has come out today. I haven't had a chance to look at it. Lambeth, Clare Holland seems to be way ahead of everybody. First emergency low traffic neighborhood up and running in Stockwell at Oval. Likely to take a bit to fully bed in, but 6 new filters freeing up 4 miles of our streets to residents. That's, I think Lambeth are kind of, Lambeth and Hackney and possibly Camden, they are front runners in London. Okay, so something about campaigns. Nationally, Transport Action Network have started their challenge to the government's 27, 29 plus billion road building program. Do go to this. They'll still need money. You can still give it. Last week, I referred to Widen My Path. That's a site where you can put your kind of concerns for what you want. It's now gone into partnership with Cycling UK. So you go onto the site through Cycling UK here on that link. There's another interesting website, and in London you can still write to council leaders using the LCC one. Do have a look at a very wonderful video from the excellent Lee Craigie, very nicely done, complete with her flip-flops. There's a rumoured scrappage scheme giving £6,000 to drivers to buy an electric car. So, you know, this is the overall context. And I almost forgot this nice little graphic. It's not going to eliminate racism, but we wouldn't have seen that 20 years ago, I don't think. So that was nice. And carry on fighting bicycle bingo. So that's it.
Thank you. So thank you for having me along. It's been interesting watching over the last few weeks. What I want to talk about is, first of all, the work we're doing for Brian in Greater Manchester on monitoring the side road zebra crossings that are going to be trialled there, and then talk a bit more broadly about monitoring of new infrastructure in general. So my first trick is to try to get the right screen to, there we go. Right, so let's start off with the assessment of side road zebra crossings and why there's a requirement for doing trials in the first place. So zebra crossings are not currently approved for side roads right up against the main road in the UK. However, that sort of crossing is very familiar to people outside the UK, where people expect to be able to cross side roads and they expect turning vehicles to give way for them. So we can't, because the priorities are different, we can't presume that experience in other countries will transfer straight across to the UK. So what we need to understand is how people respond to new facilities, and to try to do so under controlled conditions so as to get the evidence. And what we're doing is we're applying some of the experience we've had from previous trials. A number of you here will be familiar with the fact that a few years ago TRL did quite a lot of off-street trials of various types of European cycling infrastructure, and then afterwards we did some on-street monitoring when some of those were then applied on the street in the real world, which is really good to see that starting to appear. So the kind of research methods that we're applying here is, first of all, to look at the collision data. TRL collects on behalf of the government. We analyse Stats 19 data to look at, which gives you an overall picture of accident patterns, but is at a fairly low level of resolution. We will also be doing surveys of the public using various techniques, which I'll say a little bit more about later. We're also using our driving simulator to see how people respond in a virtual environment, which is always useful. And then actually doing the assessment of the on-street trials. So before the scheme goes in, and then observing how things change afterwards. And by following through this approach, so starting off with the accident data, and then looking at attitudinal research, and then progressing through simulators, and finally getting onto on-street trials, it means we've got a phased approach, so we can learn as we go along and feed that information back to TFGM. And it also means if any risks get identified in the process, we can think about how to mitigate them before we get on street. So first of all, we did a review of accident data at existing crossings, and what we're trying to compare here was fully compliant zebra crossings with a simplified form of crossing, which is what is proposed to be used at side roads. This meant identifying sites across the country where various kinds of non-standard infrastructure have been put in, because of course non-standard infrastructure does get put in quite widely, sometimes on private roads such as the supermarket accesses, but also there are actually some on the public road network. So when we compared the collisions at the full zebra crossings and at comparators with no markings, we found no significant differences in collisions. Found no significant difference between the types of collisions at full zebra crossings and the non-standard comparisons. Important to note that the sample size of collisions at the non-standard crossings was too small for statistical analysis. However, the kind of collisions were similar. So overall, we conclude that there's no indication that there's a big problem, a big safety problem associated with the existing full non-standard crossings compared with a standard zebra crossing. Hence, we didn't identify any risks that should warn us against proceeding on to the later stages in the trial. We then did some research with participants because the presumption was that we would be using standard zebra markings because they're widely used and they're familiar. But of course, the question is still: are there other types of marking that might also do the job? And also, as a control, how do people behave with something that's totally unlike an existing crossing compared with a standard one? So what we did, we had a control trial with 90 participants in it. We presented them with 112 images of road scenes on which we had marked up different types of crossings. So these aren't real, these are edited screenshots showing a range of marking types, some of which look a bit like road crossings, other of which are wholly unlike them. And it's to create a broad range from things that look like recognizable crossing markings and things that look completely different. And what we assessed was to ask them to indicate, is there a pedestrian crossing in this image, and see what their reaction time was like. So here on the chart, you can see the results. So across the bottom are the different types of crossing markings. So we have a recognizable zebra type marking. We have various kind of stripy patterns. We have bubble markings, footprints. So we have things that might be familiar to people, things that are wholly unfamiliar, and of course, an awful lot of these in practice would be very difficult to go out and mark on the roads if you were actually to use them. If you look at the recognition, it's very, very clear that the striped marking is very familiar to people. So as soon as they saw a stripe marking, and bear in mind that was all they saw was stripes on the road, they said there's a crossing there. Whereas with the other types of markings, there was a lot of doubt and uncertainty. When it was presented to the pedestrian participants, from a pedestrian perspective, there was slightly greater recognition. But even so, generally, you can see that drivers still did recognise that this was what they would regard as a crossing, which again is very helpful finding. We then wanted to look at public perceptions, and so this is about finding out how people understand a new marking. Importantly, what is it? If they recognize it's a crossing, who has priority at that point? Understanding what would they do, because we really need to make sure that people understand and behave in the way that we would wish before we put this kind of thing out there. So we asked, we did a trial at 10 sites, Manchester and London, and we asked them questions about who has priority, how safe do they feel, and how confident to cross do they feel. Now, an important point I must stress on this research is here we were comparing the standard zebra crossing with the non-standard, so no Belisha beacons, but still the stripes that we're considering for use on side road crossings. So it wasn't a complete assessment of how people would behave if there was nothing there. Very importantly, no difference in reported feelings of safety between the two types. No difference in subjective ratings of visibility between the crossing types of drivers. So that's really important. We need to make sure that they can see and will recognise that there's a crossing there. Interestingly, drivers felt less safe about this than pedestrians, about the fact that it was right up against the main road. Now, clearly in the UK, people are used to the crossings being pushed down the side road, which obviously adds to the detour and is the reason for moving it up to the side road. naturally it's more convenient for drivers if the pedestrians have to give way to them and they can use that space for themselves. If people feel safe, of course, it might, you know, in some ways there's an advantage because they're then likely to, you know, drive slower to respond to that. So that's not necessarily a bad finding. We're now getting on to things that are coming up and are, alas, delayed because of the COVID situation. So the driver simulator study involves us getting participants into the TRL site and put them in our driving simulator. We're not currently in the position to have participant trials for obvious reasons, but just to quickly go through what that entails, we have a quite sophisticated simulator in which you actually sit in a car in a room with wraparound screens. It projects images that respond to the controls. So we're able to show people simulated environments and find out how they do. I'm not showing the images that will actually be used in the simulator, A, because the trial is still being worked on, B, we don't actually want to release into the public the images that our participants will see until we actually do the trial. So here's some examples of what it looks like, and below you can see a cycle lane trial that was from the TfL trials a few years ago. So that's the kind of environment that we can create and the kind of environment the drivers will respond to. And the idea is that each driver will have a participant, they'll do 24 different runs, and what we will be looking at is different turning movements, so coming in or out of the side road, left or right. The nature of the crossing, so whether there's no crossing, whether there's a standard crossing, and the number of pedestrians that are visible to them to see how their behaviour changes. So that's the simulator study, which will be resumed as soon as more normal business resumes. Then we have the on-street trials, which will be done at 2 sites, currently a residential and a shopping one. This is before and after. So we'll be collecting video of the site for a period before the markings are put down. Then Greater Manchester will put down the road markings, and we will then observe what happens afterwards. And the video will capture the full period. What we will do is we will take a sample of pedestrians at the beginning of each hour. So it's randomized, but it's done in a structured way. And what we're looking at is who gives way, how long it takes people to cross, and what interactions take place. And we use a conflict scale there, where at the lowest level, two road users might interact. They continue, one observes the other, they continue their path without without having to take any evasive action. And then the second level is that people might take a precautionally give way and let the other one pass, right through up to more severe levels of interaction where someone has to brake suddenly or stop suddenly. By looking at the levels of interactions, we're able to get an assessment of the risk because, and of course, fortunately, actual collisions are very rare. So what we're looking at is the behaviours that lead towards actual collisions. So by looking at the lower level conflicts, we can take an understanding as to whether the level of risk has changed. And clearly, we want to understand, are drivers willing to give way? And amongst the factors that we're very interested in there is how much does that respond to the level of traffic? So will people, if traffic is heavy and people are anxious about getting across the road in a gap, will they be less willing to give way to pedestrians if it means that they miss their gap and have to have to wait longer? That is all subject to delay because of COVID. Apart from anything else, we want to make sure that we are looking at realistic traffic flows and pedestrian flows. So, we're having an ongoing discussion with TFGM about when everyone thinks the conditions are right to go ahead and do that. So that's a quick overview of the work that we're doing for TFGM and working with Brian on. I wanted to flag up, because while that work is delayed, there is, as has been discussed in these sessions, a lot of temporary infrastructure has been put up all over the country of various kinds and various qualities. Clearly, it would be good if a lot of that temporary infrastructure becomes permanent and becomes improved, and is, bollards are replaced with more solid infrastructure, which means the case will have to be made for keeping or improving it. And at the moment, the focus is very much in what kind of infrastructure goes in where, and are the local authorities sufficiently motivated to do the right thing? Are they going to spend the money in the right way? In the longer term, we're going to need the evidence as to what impact that's had. So, I wanted to flag up a discussion really about how do we make sure that in this pop-up infrastructure, that the benefits and the impacts are actually properly measured, that this is thought about now as the schemes go in, and not afterwards when it's too late to get a lot of the data. And we really want to understand things like, what's worked and what hasn't worked. How has behavior changed? Are people, from the point of view of the modal choices people make, are they more or less likely to carry on cycling or walking if this infrastructure's improved, given them more space, improved their environment? But also the behaviors on the road, looking at things like, are people giving away? Are there conflicts? Are there places where we can improve things and need to? So we need to get hard evidence in order to do that. So the kind of tools that I was talking about that we're using for the side road crossings, so things like getting videos, doing properly designed surveys where you've got a decent sample size, and you've got it, you've designed it properly beforehand. Use of counting tubes and things to get traffic flow data, and really to get quantifiable evidence in a scientific way, where we can compare before and afterwards, so that we're not reliant on the kind of problems that you often get with new infrastructure, where the data is not collected, and you get anecdotal data. People will say, oh, this is terribly dangerous. People might take their own video, which is cherry picked for particular situations that happen to them, and that's very hard to refute unless you've got a whole bank of a week's worth of video where you've identified systematically what the conflicts were like. All too often, monitoring is forgotten about when schemes go in. It's not surprising when there's a situation like this. The budgets are mostly focused on capital. It's harder to do these things, but we need to think about how to make sure it's done. And I think, as we've seen in some of these sessions in previous weeks, there's been a lot of really good work done by campaigners, done by local groups on doing surveys, on getting that kind of evidence there. So I think there's opportunities for partnerships for getting this kind of monitoring done, through community groups, as well as hopefully some of the local authorities will be able to start, doing their own monitoring, doing it properly, as we get into these schemes. So that's what I was hoping to flag up there. Just to point out, the images I've got here come from the trials we did at the TRL site a few years ago for TfL, showing wands and the zebras that Brian was using in Camden. And is looking at the effects of geometry on side road crossings. So again, a lot of these are the kind of techniques that are going to be very useful in pop-up in temporary infrastructure. And we already have some methods there for trialing them and some understanding. So I think I'd be really interested in other people's views really on how do we take this forward. So thank you. I shall leave it there. My contact details.
So this idea for a presentation came up with a conversation Brian and I were having about this whole thing. I've been working on pavement parking and 20 miles an hour legislation in the Welsh Government. So I'm kind of getting my head around the way a lot of these acts and regulations work. And I thought I'd have a go at thinking how we could make zebras without globes, Belisha beacons and zigzags legal as simply as we could, because it's not easy to change the law, particularly when it gets a bit complicated. And just to take up, I think Marcus said it's not possible to do side road zebras. I think it is, and there are examples out there. The problem is we can't do them without all the paraphernalia of beacons and zigzags, and they're not really designed and laid out in the guidance to work at side roads. But I don't think there's anything legally preventing them being placed there. It's just they're a bit clunky and expensive. So this is the image that was taken from the B-Lines document, and is what Manchester is aiming for. That doesn't do anything as it stands for cyclists, but Brian and I we've talked that once we've cracked zebras, then we can, it shouldn't be too difficult to get the new cousin, the parallel crossing, so the cyclists enjoy priority as well. So that's clearly what we're looking to try to achieve. What we can do at the moment, and this is a parallel crossing, this is in Acox Green in Birmingham. So it's all a bit clunky. We have to have the zigzags. The law says there should be 8, but you can go down to 2 in particular circumstances, but sometimes engineers find that hard to justify, so that all gets a bit complicated. This one, you can see there are 2 on the approach, so this is one side of a dual carriageway. You can see the crossing on the other side. But then we have to have all the electrical supply to the globes, and that I think, I don't have the figures to hand, maybe Brian or others can comment, but I think something like 3 to 4 times the cost by the time you've put in the electrical supply for the globes. So yeah, what are we going to do about it? So I think there are options that authorities like Manchester and authorities generally can do. They can just take the legal risk and put down the simple crossings anyway, without all this paraphernalia. Or we can go with DFT support and government support and create an entirely new type of crossing in the regulations, or we can amend the existing regulations in some way. Now, the first of those, you can see that is an example in Longbridge. That's not an adopted road, but as Marcus said, the stripes are very well recognised. The paper that Mark referred to, drivers do respond to stripes. So I'm pretty confident we can have. Well, we have confidence that these things will work once they go down. It's how do we do it legally? There's our old friend TSRGD 2016. It's got a long period, a long history. The previous one was 2002. It was simplified to some extent in 2016, but it's still a massive document and extremely complicated. And like all these documents that get added to over the years, they're a bit of a kind of ramshackle affair with one clause referring to another, and it all kind of builds up as a picture. So that's a difficult thing to amend and add an entirely new crossing, perhaps. This is what a zebra crossing consists of in the regulations, and you can see there are different components too. I'm sure many people know this. You've got the stripes themselves, which are referred to as stripes in the regulations. You've got the giveaway marking or giveaway line, which is different to a normal giveaway line, but it's legal function. It's a single dash, and that is the function of the giveaway line. It's got those white dots, which are the so-called item 55 marking. They are optional, you don't have to have those. And then we've got the control zone, which is marked by zigzags. And all of those different bits have a legal function. TSRGD says in great detail what it looks like and what behaviour rules they mandate, and those are the regulations, and then how they're applied, and those are the directions. So that's what we're kind of grappling with. Delve a bit deeper. So we then go into this paragraph, which is clunkily cited as paragraph 19 in Schedule 14. Schedule 14 is the bit of TSRGD that deals with signals and crossings. And this says what the giveaway line does. And it says conveys to vehicular traffic, not the driver, interestingly, conveys to the traffic proceeding towards the zebra crossing the position at or before which a vehicle must be stopped. So if you don't have the giveaway line and you just have the stripes, there's nothing in law that says that the driver has to stop. So that's an important component in the crossing as it currently stands. And can we know that drivers obey the stripes? They don't really look at the giveaway marking, but legally that's what they actually obey. And then we've got this other bit, this is taken from the definitions. It defines the zebra controlled area, and there's a similar clause for the parallel controlled area And it says what that's doing, and it's constituted with zigzag lines and all the rest of it. As I say, there's similar requirements for the controlled area and the giveaway marking at parallel crossings. Hope you're staying with all this. There'll be questions afterwards. What is a zebra crossing? Well, this is the definition. It's a provision where provision is made for pedestrians to cross the carriageway, and the presence of which is indicated by a yellow globe, which everyone calls a Belisha beacon, but legally is called a yellow globe. But here's the thing, and this is, I think, the little hook. In the TSRG 2016, a new set of words was added, and it says, except that globes need not be present at a crossing that only crosses a cycle track. And I thought, well, maybe that's a little loophole that we could explore and sort of widen a bit. So we can look a bit further. So again, this is back to Schedule 14. We now have Para 25. And this also says we don't have to have a controlled area where the zebra crossing, it's a fully legal zebra crossing in all other respects. We don't have to have a controlled area where the zebra is across a cycle track, or that part of the carriageway that is a cycle track, it says. And again, it reiterates that we don't need the yellow globe marking. So this is my attempt at legal changes. So this is back to the wording we had before. What is a zebra crossing? The presence of which is indicated by a yellow globe, etc., except that it's not present at a cycle track, except that the globes need not be present in circumstances set out in Para 25 of Schedule 14, Part 1. I think that's how we could do it, because you wouldn't want to put all the kind of stuff here. And then how would we reword the critical paragraph? How would we reword that? Well, that's what it says at the moment. We don't need it when they cross a cycle track. My suggestion is this: where the crossing is placed across the carriageway of a minor road in the vicinity of a junction and the nearest edge of the black and white stripes is no more than 10 meters from the giveaway sign, then we don't need the controlled area, and exactly the same wording means we don't need the globes. Now, minor road is usefully defined in the regulations, and the giveaway sign doesn't mean the dotted marking. It's actually a giveaway sign, a vertical sign, or the stop sign. So we don't have to have the marking. That's what a minor road is, and that's what the giveaway sign is. So I think that kind of gets us there. So how would we do that? Well, it's not that difficult. You know, DFT officials will sometimes say this is all terribly difficult, but actually making amendments to TSRG is not procedurally difficult. There doesn't have to be a vote in the House. It's just second. Obviously, you have to draft it and get all the parliamentary legal equals to sign all this off, but there doesn't have to be a debate, doesn't have to be any votes, just laid before Parliament. Unless anyone objects to it, which no one ever does, then it just sails through under what's called a negative procedure. So I think what we get is this, which is pretty similar to what the B-Lines document calls for, except it's got the giveaway markings. And they're, as I say, they are legally required to define what the driver has to do on the approach to a crossing. So I don't think that's too bad. And I think we could do that. We could put pressure on the Great We, put pressure on DFT to see whether they were up for that change if they accept, and the research that Marcus talked about gives us the right answers. So that's what I wanted to run through.
Yeah, so lots of people are asking, well, okay, the pop-up lanes are going in. I showed this many weeks ago now. Time's flying is a kind of basic thing to do. But what happens when these pop-up lanes meet junctions? I'm already seeing some quite tricky photos where I'm a little bit worried about the way people are just leading stuff up to stop lines and then going, off you go, sunshine. Not particularly good. We're trying to encourage people who maybe been cycling at the weekend, and we know there's 4 times as many people doing that from some of the data I've seen. So we've got to keep them happy when they're trying to actually start riding into work. So anyway, what do we do at Junction? Stop ambling. There's the thing. These things are being built. It's all good. I was talking about this with Phil the other week, a kind of mixing zone. I had a quick go saying what could a mixing zone actually look like, and I've put it into a perspective view so that more people can understand what on earth we're going on about. But in this case, it's the idea that the cyclists go through that near side with priority to then position themselves either in that kind of second lane across or in the near side, wherever they choose to, in the most defensive position to kind of go ahead. And the cars that are coming over into that left turning lane have to give way, so they have to give way to cyclists passing through there. Then they pass over. The theory of a mixing zone is that you manage the conflict on the way to the stop line, not at the point where the light goes green and all hell breaks loose and suddenly you've been left at the middle and you've got a heavy left turning traffic coming across you. That's our number one cause of fatality, particularly in London. So I'm really keen to avoid that kind of arrangement. So I think this is like the most basic thing you can do, and we're talking about doing this in Greater Manchester as like just a kind of basic ask. It's the sort of Danish style approach, albeit they have many variations, and they've been using it quite a bit in New York and across the States as well. So that's basically what one is. So for a couple of like temporary islands and a couple of flexible posts and a couple of giveaways, you can kind of legally do that. I'm putting an extra giveaway and maybe a couple of like COVID emergency temporary situation signs on the approach. But that's what one looks like, and that's kind of how it works. It's not like the highest level of service, but it'll give you some kind of chance. And we need something to tell cyclists if they are going into some of these big junctions, because a lot of the pop-up lanes are on very big roads with pretty awful junctions. We need something to tell people, hey, think about it now. You come to a junction, think about your positioning. That's really what this does as a kind of basic ask. Let's talk about this baby as well. This is one that Phil did in Bexley-Heath, where he pulled out a signal control junctions, and bagging signal junctions is an option. It gives you a lot more chances to pedestrianise pedestrians in particular. So this vastly improved the collision rate. I'm sure Phil could talk more. Gets the same amount, if not more, traffic through. We've seen that in similar schemes in Poynton. So there's nothing stopping you. I'm showing some designs from an urban design group document on an emergency transport that's coming out quite shortly. In fact, I thought it was out today, but it's not come out. It's Leicester's day today. Maybe this is one for tomorrow. But yeah, just bag the signals, stick in some implied zebras, implied roundabouts. So in this case, not the zebras that we've been talking about previously, some kind of marked them blue in a London street space style. So this kind of thing has been proved to work. So you can paint your way out of a lot of issues, particularly for pedestrians. The downside with doing this is, like, if you bagged the signals and you bagged the invitation to cross for visually impaired people who are relying on that green man as the safest time to get across, that's where you will get some kind of kickback. Did work pretty well in Bexley-Heath though, so for me this needs to be on the table. But I'm going to show you some even wackier ideas now, and I'm going to show this in the perspective of a kind of temporary protective junction. Now again, you could bag the signals and just paint in implied stuff and let people roll through. But I think there's a potentially cheekier way of keeping the signal junctions on. And I'm going to explain this quickly on this little visualization I did for if you're arriving on the near side as a cyclist. We'll do cyclists and then we'll do pedestrians in a bit. So you get, like, the green's gone. You're on the other side of that bollard in the foreground, and I've painted some kind of colourful crossing across the thing there. So anyway, you'll cycle through, you'll go through at the same time as vehicles. It'll be standard method of control, a kind of north-south cars, east-west cars, and then an old PED stage. That's our method of control here. So you're going through and agreeing with that van, but you'd be a little bit worried perhaps about that van cutting across you to the left, even if he's not indicating, he might well be. You'll have an option of either going through, straight through the lane, coming out of the light segregation earlier and just mixing it so you're kind of in line with that van, so he's not going to hook across you. So all the standard ways that we're trained to get through these junctions still apply. Or for the new people, they have this kind of near side space to kind of go and wait in. So you can go in that near side as that advisory bit of coloured green, and there's some kind of like a raised curb. I've made that look like a particular product that some people will recognise, but that kind of thing could be in a junction. And the concept of a protected junction, really, as I see it, is that there's some kind of protection in the mouth of the junction itself. So then that van turns round, avoids the curb, avoids the flexible post. You can go, all right, he's out of the way. And then the cyclists, particularly the ones that are doing it for the first time, can have real full sight of the junction and judge for themselves when they feel it's safest to get across. Maybe they'll let all the lefts go, then go, okay, I'll go across now, in which case they're kind of guided to another protected area before they're dropped in segregation at the other side. So that's the kind of green situation. If you arrive and that light's red, then you just held back at the stop line. And it could be that cyclists wait in that green area for all the traffic to kind of end, on all the different movements ahead, which place they can kind of creep across and go. I'll just ask them to mute while I explain this. So yeah, it can work with exactly the same method of control that we've got, and you can basically like circulate cyclists round, or at least do it stage by stage to cut across. But for me, particularly when you're coming across a major junction, this is kind of the behaviour that some cyclists do, kind of crawl over to the side, have a little look, when is it safe to go, particularly if you haven't done it for a while and you're really worried and you're really kind of hugging that curve. I think we need to put something in to protect people. And this really, yeah, it cordons off some of the space, but you've already taken a lane out for general traffic on the approach. So the space is there. One of the things I put in, and this is like potentially the more controversial element, is the use of a colourful crossing. So let's do the pedestrian journey now. So a pedestrian comes up to there and they can kind of go, all right, it's on a red, I haven't got a green man, I'll just wait here. And they can wait and like potentially push a button, it could be activated, and that green man comes, and then they've got a conflict-free crossing, the way it actually works in real life. But we find with pedestrians, particularly in London, and I've seen this elsewhere as well, that not a lot of them are waiting for that green man. You know, that like it takes so long. Normally our cycle times are so long, and Phil and I could talk about turning the corner for you and how we could get that efficiency all day long. But for this case, if the pedestrian does walk out because they don't want to wait, perhaps there's lots of people congregating and they're feeling the pressure of like closely associating people in the middle of a pandemic, and they do go, actually, it's clear enough, I'll walk now. Maybe they didn't see a turning car, but like with the use of that kind of colourful crossing, that kind of checkerboard effect, colourful crossing, I'm hoping that any drivers turning, and again, we'll warn them with signs on the approach, the kind of COVID style signs. I'm hoping that they'll turn and go, actually, I should be looking out for pedestrians here. That's really what we want for the colourful crossing. So if a pedestrian does effectively jaywalk, which is completely illegal, I should say, talking about the law, completely legal for pedestrians to do. If they do step out, albeit we'd prefer them to cross on the green man, but if they do, there's some element of protection there. And there's quite a few junctions in the UK that don't even have green men. So again, this kind of provision would help those that are stepping out and do need that extra protection from turning cars. So for me, it prioritises walking in particular. Like we'd like people wait for the green, but whenever they go, there's some element of protection. So we're kind of dealing with the behaviour we've got, and particularly during the emergency when people step out, we need an extra bit of assurance, I feel. And for cyclists, you've got that kind of a safe haven to kind of wait and judge when you think it's safe to cross. And there's some kind of marking with the use of the elephant footprints, which again, completely legal. In this case, they're just saying the cycle route goes that way at Signal Junction, which is like their standard use. So effectively, without changing any of the method of control, we can get a virtual protected junction just by dropping a few objects and a bit of painting around. And that's the kind of big one that I'm putting out. I wanted something that we could do without having to redo the whole geometry and change all the signals, because it's expensive and it takes time. Getting one computer chip for the signals could take you 6 weeks turnaround if you have a fair wind. So what can we do right now? For me, this is the sort of thing we need to look at. It's the kind of thing they're looking at in America and a few other places where they've got similar terrible junction to us. So for me, this gets us like most of the way there to the kind of essence of a protected junction. I'd prefer that we had cyclops and things like that and the turn and the corner style junctions everywhere, but that's a long legal battle. In the meantime, we can get most of the way there for the new cyclists, and I think most cyclists arriving at near side will kind of understand what it means, even though a lot of these things don't have any strict legal meaning, as it were. So that's my 2 pennies worth. That's what's going to come out in the Urban Design Group guidance, and it'd be interesting to see whether people run with it. For me, this is what we should be doing at the moment, prioritising walking and cycling and warning drivers to kind of keep clear. I was in the Times at the weekend talking about flashing ambers and saying I don't even want any green lights on any junctions at the moment. In the middle of an emergency, cars have got to start slowing down. They can't just zoom off. For me, this goes a long way towards getting that behaviour as well, albeit with paint rather than like getting some legislation change. that's about it from me. I'll leave that one lingering and open it up to a little bit of discussion.